Well, thank you for joining us. In this week's Finding God in Video Games Rewind, we're taking a look back at the Bioshock series. Join us as we take a deeper dive into Bioshock and a little something around, I don't know, the trigger responses that each of us have. So would you kindly join me? So let's get into Bioshock. There's something about the atmosphere in the original Bioshock, the very first game, that set it apart immediately from just about any other game. The underwater city of Rapture is it's kind of a character in its own right. It kind of presents a murky vision of a futuristic world that's seemingly drawn from like a Jules Verne novel, or maybe a discarded concept from a Disneyland ride that's about to go haywire. Gazing out the windows into that ocean landscape, marveling at the exquisite architecture, you can't help but wish for a happier ending for this broken dream world. And as we progress through the enigmatic structure, we're guided by an invisible benefactor named Atlas. Gentlemanly fellow who provides a lot of verbal insight and cues along our way throughout our sojourn in Rapture. Very, very polite individual, and at the time we didn't really question his existence or his motivations for helping us. In this refined society gone wrong, his soothing voice of reason would seem to be the only ally that we had to survive through the chaos. And as he provided clues that we needed to solve the puzzles and escape, we kind of gave him almost our implicit trust. Now, I will tell you there's some spoilers ahead for a game that is many, many years old, so proceed at your own peril. But it turns out that calm voice of Atlas in our ear, the only dependable acquaintance that we made throughout our journey in Rapture, the only person who doesn't seem to be trying to kill us, was the final rug to be pulled out from underneath us. After performing all of his bidding, the realization hits that Atlas has been the instigator of the anarchy that we've been waiting through the entire time, and we have been nothing more than a tool to accomplish his grim tasks. His seemingly genuine and mannerly approach to ask "would you kindly" prior to each request, those were actually trigger words to compel our character to obey. We were never in control. From the moment that he uttered those words, we were a pawn at his disposal. Both as the player as well as the character, this betrayal of trust was kind of a gut punch, as we recall all of the ways that we've been actually acting against our own best interest and moving away from our desired path. All because of the uttering of this innocent phrase, "would you kindly?" I remember that moment sticking me like a knife between the shoulder blades as I was sent mentally reeling, trying to sort out what I actually knew to be true from what I'm now doubting was ever true in the first place. Now that my trusted source of knowledge has been revealed as a fraud, I had to challenge all that I had believed up to that point. And unfortunately, many of my decisions were now filled with regret as I realized I had chosen the wrong side in this war. Now, in fairness, this is a mechanism within the game. There are no alternate paths to this point. But the point still remains. Trigger responses to certain words or situations exist every day in the real world, just like they do in the world of Rapture. And while the phrasing may not be "would you kindly," there are certainly patterns to these potentially destructive pathways presented to us each and every day. When I look in the mirror, I realize that through a combination of my family upbringing, generation culture I was born into, and of course my own unique personality, I've developed some very unappreciated, built-in, conditioned responses or triggers inside of me, much like my Bioshock protagonist. This has not been a passive process. I've been an active part of my own emotional maturity and behavior patterns throughout the years. But regardless of whether it's through intention or adoption, these areas of my life have formed into a little more than stimulus response than I care to admit. I was concerned that I was alone in this struggle with triggered responses, whether these occur through verbal interactions, physical cues, or maybe just an unplanned emotional reaction to an external influence. So I embarked on a journey in the Bible to find a name most of us should recognize who dealt with their fair share of "would you kindly" trigger responses as well. So let's begin with a man that the Bible identifies as a friend of God in James chapter 2. This man was challenged by God to uproot his life and take on a nomadic existence en route to a land that would belong to him and his descendants for the rest of all recorded time. And he boldly accepted the journey. In Genesis 12, we find Abram, the patriarch of the Jewish nation, starting out on his voyage of faith. But Abram had a trigger response that reveals itself in verses 10 through 13 as we see this mighty man of faith resort to misguided deception to protect himself. Abram was near the beginning of his initial pilgrimage from his homeland, just taking a pit stop in Egypt when he asked his wife to do a very curious favor. At this time, he had not yet been given his name Abraham, the new name God would give him. He was simply known as Abram. Now, when we think of Abram or Abraham and his wife Sarah, we conjure up a mental picture of maybe some old gray-beard guy, his wrinkly old wife. Go ahead and Google it if you want. I'll wait. That's what you're going to find. But apparently Sarah was quite the looker, so much so that Abram had legitimate concerns over his own personal safety because of her exceptional beauty. So while they were traveling, Abram was so concerned that his wife's good looks would make him a target for, we'll just say, some not-so-gentle replacement by another suitor. By other men in the area, he urged her to pretend that they were merely siblings and not actually married, so he could avoid any specific unpleasantness around her maybe being acquired by somebody else through nefarious means. And I'm sure that idea went over really well in their household. Abram's plan was about as foolproof as you might expect, and this only resulted in a huge mess. No less than the king of Egypt himself saw Sarah, and the game was over. The king made plans to bring who he thought was Abram's sister into his home, with plans to make her his new bride. And the unwitting Pharaoh, Sarah, and Abram were now in a very challenging, compromising situation. Now, fortunately for everyone, God intervened, and a furious Pharaoh sent both Abram and Sarah away with a fitting rebuke for their misdirection and the potential consequences that could have occurred. Now, you would think Abram learned from this bizarre situation that put him at odds with one of the most powerful rulers of the world at that time. You would think that, but you would be wrong. As heinous as it is to pretend your wife is your sister and allow her to be taken by another man just to save your own skin, I'm going to try to give Abram the benefit of the doubt on this one. He was early in his walk with the Lord. He was only 75 years old at this point. He was in a scary foreign land. We'll just chalk it up as a learning opportunity, okay? I hope you're catching my sarcasm here. This was definitely one of the dumbest ideas since Adam and Eve tried to play hide and seek with God while wearing fig leaves. But let's go to Genesis 20, as we find that our newly renamed protagonist Abraham in a similar predicament. Between chapters 12 and chapters 20 of Genesis, a whole lot transpired in his life. There was the whole one-on-one conversation with God full of promises and guarantees. He won multiple wars with local kings in the area. There was the whole Hagar and Ishmael debacle. All while Abraham has been the beneficiary of a remarkable blessing from the Lord. He's become incredibly wealthy. He's experienced success in multiple arenas of his life, with all the promises of God kind of coming true for him, so much tangible proof of his charmed life. Why do we see Abraham responding to the exact same circumstances in chapter 20 the way that Abram did back in chapter 12? And as you'll see, the conditions were ripe for a triggered response. Identical stimuli, identical reaction. This time we catch up with Abraham, and he's dealing with another king, this one named Abimelech. Abraham has an excellent chance to take a different path this time around, but he doesn't. The story unfolds much the same way. Abraham and Sarah playing the role of siblings rather than spouses results in King Abimelech braining her into his harem to become his wife. This is almost 25 years after the first time that this happened. And it ends, once again, as you might expect, God once again steps in to stop the madness. Abimelech angrily questions both Abraham and Sarah on the ruse, and we receive the same justification from Abraham one more time. So how can this horrible pattern exist within one of the patriarchs of our faith? Most importantly, how can this cycle be broken? I'm looking for a hope that this can be stopped at its source, and as always, Scripture does not disappoint. Abraham wasn't a coward. He trekked across the desert with nothing more than the promise of protection along his way, and he wasn't afraid of combat. We observe that in his campaign to rescue his nephew Lot in Genesis 14, when he led just 318 men into battle against the combined armies of 4 enemy kings. So the root cause here is outside of simple fear. As was previously revealed in Abraham's decision to work outside of God's will and create Ishmael, Abraham showed a pressing need in those examples to solve God's problems for him, rather than reaching out to God in prayer and trusting him for the protection that he had guaranteed. Abraham had a conditioned response to make proactive and regretful decisions on his own, including resorting to trickery and deception rather than allowing God to handle the problems that existed. So let's get to the solution. We catch up with Abraham in Genesis 22. Once more, he's given a seemingly impossible mission. God commands him to literally sacrifice his son Isaac without a word of explanation as to why. So what will Abraham choose to do? Once again, he's presented with a Kobayashi Maru no-win scenario. But this time we don't see Abraham try to pull off any kind of bait and switch and trick his way out of the predicament. Facing an impossible choice, Abraham finally places the responsibility of solving this problem on his heavenly Father, telling his son in verse 8, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, in spite of the fact that God had promised no such thing. Abraham finally demonstrated the faith that he is now known for as he finally accepted the reality that this was not his problem to solve. He simply had to obey and allow God to supply the answer in his time and in his way. And there's the same hope for all of us, that as our programmed responses can be deleted and a new subroutine built in its place, we do have an enemy, the devil, who specializes in crafting these would you kindly moments to reduce us to angry neurons simply reacting in our flesh. But once we accept that the battle is the Lord's and it has already been won, we can choose to stop the trigger response before it occurs and give God the space to step in and provide a way of escape. Now, before we end, a word of caution. The last thing I want to convey is a trite and simplistic solution to what can be a very complex and at times lengthy struggle. Abraham was 100 years old by the time that he finished his journey and was prepared to offer Isaac to the Lord. Each of us have different battles, some of which may be deeply ingrained in our subconscious. Others can cling to us through maybe chemical dependencies, and still others crop up simply through the day-to-day battle of spirit versus the flesh. But I'm encouraged to continue to face my trigger responses, just like our fictional character in Bioshock or the real-life example of Abraham. I see that the eventual and permanent victory exists if I choose to uncover and confront the root cause issue and submit it to the Lord in prayer before responding, as many times as is necessary. Now, would you kindly join me?